It was early morning at Mwishowa Barabara Secondary School, and the classroom sat empty, silent. Kamau, the young English teacher, sat at his desk, staring at a stack of papers. His fingers drummed lightly on the wood, but his mind was far away. The sun filtered softly through the windows, painting golden streaks across the chalkboard. He looked up out the window, but he wasn't seeing the fields or the trees. Instead, his thoughts drifted to Esther.
This is getting dangerous.
His feelings for her were becoming harder to ignore. He shook his head, trying to refocus on the day ahead. The chalk in his hand felt heavy as he began to erase yesterday's lesson from the board, but his thoughts were stuck in a loop. Meanwhile, Esther sat in class, her mind just as distracted. She was always so focused, her notebooks always neat, her eyes always on the teacher. But today, something was different. The hum of her classmates' whispers and the occasional giggles didn't reach her.
Why can't I concentrate today?
She sat there staring at the window, her pen rolling absent-mindedly between her fingers. Then Mr. Kamau entered. His presence brought a familiar tension into the room. Mr. Kamau, a Kenyan black handsome man, stood at the front of the classroom, his eyes scanning the room with a mix of authority and distraction. As he started the lesson, his voice became background noise to Esther's thoughts. She glanced up just for a second, catching his eye across the room. Her heart skipped a beat. His gaze lingered on her, just a moment too long. The sound of a classmate coughing snapped her out of her daze.
Oh no, did anyone notice?
She quickly looked down, her cheeks warm, feeling caught even though no one else noticed. But Mr. Kamau did. He quickly turned back to the chalkboard, continuing his lesson, though his mind wandered back to that fleeting connection. The staff room was quieter than usual, as Mrs. Kamene, the sharp-eyed deputy head teacher, sat with Mr. Otieno, sipping their afternoon tea. The clink of their cups against the saucers was the only sound for a while, but Mrs. Kamene couldn't stay silent for long. Her brows furrowed and she leaned in slightly, her voice low.
Have you noticed anything strange between Mr. Kamau and that girl, Esther?
She asked, her tone carrying an edge of suspicion. Mr. Otieno, slow to catch on, raised his eyebrows.
What do you mean?
Mrs. Kamene set her cup down, leaning back in her chair.
I've seen the way he looks at her. It's not right.
Now intrigued, Mr. Otieno nodded slowly.
I've heard some students talking. It's starting to get noticed.
The two exchanged a serious look.
We need to keep an eye on them.
They both knew the school's reputation could be at stake, and things could get out of hand if they weren't careful. Out in the schoolyard, under the shade of the acacia tree, Esther sat alone during lunch break, her favorite book, Things Fall Apart, open on her lap. But she wasn't reading. Her mind was far from the pages of the novel, lost in the confusing feelings she had about Mr. Kamau. She didn't hear him approach until he was almost beside her.
Esther.
His voice was gentle, yet there was a quiet urgency to it. Startled, she looked up at him.
Sir.
She replied, her voice barely above a whisper, her fingers gripping the edges of the book. Mr. Kamau crouched slightly so that they were eye level, his expression soft but serious.
Are you okay? You've seemed distracted.
Esther nodded quickly, but it was clear she wasn't fine. Her chest tightened as the weight of everything they'd been trying to ignore pressed down on her.
I'm just worried about what people are saying.
Mr. Kamau hesitated, glancing around to make sure no one was watching them.
We haven't done anything wrong. We just need to be careful.
Their words hung in the air like secrets, unsaid but understood. They knew this couldn't go on like this for much longer. After school, Esther stood by the gate, her heart racing. The sun was setting, casting a warm orange glow over the path leading out of the school. She looked around nervously, waiting for Mr. Kamau. When she saw him approaching, her breath caught in her throat. He walked slowly, his briefcase in one hand, his eyes scanning their surroundings. As he came closer, Esther's heart pounded in her chest. The village path behind them was deserted, and the houses in the distance were too far away for anyone to see.
Sir, they're starting to talk. The students, the teachers, they're saying there's something going on between us.
Mr. Kamau's face darkened. He looked down at the ground for a moment, then back at her.
We haven't done anything wrong.
He said again, but this time his voice was softer, almost pleading with himself as much as with her.
I know, but it doesn't matter. People think there's something, and I don't know what to do.
Mr. Kamau stepped closer, lowering his voice.
I care about you, Esther, but we need to be smart. We can't let anyone find out.
Her heart swelled at his words, but the fear remained, clenching tight inside her chest. A storm was brewing, not just in their hearts but in the sky above. Dark clouds gathered, casting a shadow over the once bright schoolyard. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves of the acacia tree where they now stood, far from prying eyes. Esther stood with her arms crossed, biting her lip, her face etched with distress. Mr. Kamau stood in front of her, his shirt and tie flapping slightly in the wind. His worry was evident, but he tried to remain calm.
We can't keep going like this. Everyone knows. Or they think they do.
Mr. Kamau glanced at the sky, then back at her.
I know.
He replied, but there was no solution in his voice. No plan, just the weight of the situation pressing down on both of them.
I don't want to get you in trouble, but I don't know how to stop feeling like this.
The rain began to fall, soft at first, then harder, the sound mingling with the wind and the growing storm. Mr. Kamau looked at her, wanting to say something more, something that would make it all better. But all he could do was reach out slightly, his hand hovering between them. As the rain fell, they stood there, caught between their feelings and the reality of the world around them, a world that was closing in, threatening to expose their secret.